exploit those weaknesses today and not let this carry on for a decade.
Yeah, we should.
Well, we've reached noon, or a little bit after noon. So I think the panel will probably stick around for a couple of minutes.
Yo, Bosco, no question?
Are there questions? Joe, do you have questions? Sure.
I wanted to thank Mike for the history lesson. Fantastic presentations by all of you. In fact, Mike, if you look at St. John's Review a couple years ago, I did an analysis of the history, which may have some relevance to what you were discussing about today.
I've not seen that.
Okay, St. John's Review, 2 years ago. And I've got a piece coming out on history as well. But the premise of the entire, you make the point, I think a valid one, that U.S. policy has been entrenched in terms of a pro-China orientation, a pro-China bias. But all of that was premised on the assumption that engagement, that working with China, that bringing China into the international community would moderate and soften its policies, both domestically and in terms of foreign policy. It's clear over the last few years that premise has been unfounded, that China has rejected, in fact, Kissinger states in his book on China, that Beijing doesn't accept the international order with which it had no part in creating. So we've seen that now in the South China Sea, the East China Sea. Beijing rejects the basic premises of the international order. So given that, I think one can make the statement that our policy has been a monumental and historic failure in terms of the entire premise of engagement with China.
One sentence reply. I really admire Kissinger's book on China. I thought the reviews were unfair. They focused on human rights and things he never did and whether he loves Mao and Zhou Enlai or not. What Kissinger did in that book is he rethought the original assumptions he and Nixon and Ford had.
And justified them.
And he criticizes himself, and he draws on some work done here at Hudson by a guy named Abe Shulsky, that the Chinese, when provoked, prefer the use of force in a sudden, sharp, psychological surprise attack.
You know, after years of preparing psychologically to undermine the will of the opponent.
Yes, they then withdraw. They don't, it's not like Hitler occupying territory for Lebensraum. They then withdraw, and he opens his book with the story of 1962 and India. Then he works in a lot of Chinese warring states, proverbs, and the approach they have to why the use of force against another country should be, according to China, should be forgiven. It was just a message or a signal to make you kind of sober up. And Kissinger spends a whole chapter on this. Then he says a World War I style conflict could break out between the U.S. and China. He has a chapter on that. So this is a very different set of assumptions than Kissinger held back in 71, 72. So Kissinger in many ways has shown the way for both a hidden history and to rethink his assumptions. Now others ought to follow his example.
Okay.
We ought to have accountability, in my view, for those who were wrong.
Please read my review of Kissinger's book in St. John's Review. Kissinger said 2 years ago that Taiwan should make its accommodation with Beijing as quickly as possible because, quote, China will not wait forever. Nixon, who was also the real politiker at that time, changed his view on China and Taiwan and indicated that the situation has now evolved, Taiwan being a permanent democracy. There is no reason for the U.S. to favor China in that relationship any further, that we should have a form of diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Anyway, that gets to the question I was going to ask, which is, what do you think you talked about the capabilities of Taiwan in terms of resisting the U.S., the China aggression, and Michael talked about the intentions of U.S. policy, referred to Russert's statements on the Hill, 6 assurances. What is wrong with the U.S. declaring the end of strategic ambiguity? That would be a first step in terms of the normalization of relations, declaring that it is in both our interest, our geopolitical interest, and our moral values for us to defend Taiwan against any form of aggression from China.
Another conference, perhaps?
Just very quick, the strategic ambiguity, in my view, it usually has a military context. It's much better off to, the basic idea of getting rid of strategic ambiguity is best applied at the political level. In other words, be explicit about granting legitimacy to governments on both sides of the Taiwan Strait. That is the best form of strategic, getting rid of, in terms of, that is the ambiguous aspect that really should be done away with. And be much more clear about having normal relations with both sides. That's the best form. It's really a political problem. Military is an important part of it, but it's really the political issue that needs to be addressed at the heart of it.
And are we ready for a psychological surprise attack by China
They do it to us every single day.
if something like that is done with Taiwan?
They already do it. They've done it to us since 1971, and this is a success. They have pulled the wool over our eyes to be able to fool us from what the objective reality is, that you have two legitimate governments, ROC and PRC, and they have kicked our butt when it comes to political warfare by not having us realize objective reality.
You get the last word.
I've had a chance myself several years ago to observe close hand as Director of International Broadcasting for the government our public diplomatic efforts. And my remarks on the questions of our preparedness for responding to or conducting psychological warfare wouldn't take more than a couple of seconds, and we don't even have that at this point. So thank you very much for your thoughtful questions and your excellent listening, and thank you, panel, for fine presentations, and this discussion will indeed be continued. Afternoon.
Yes, Mark. Good to see you.